Okay, I think I'll let the others in whenever they join so we can get started. Thank y'all everyone for joining. My name is Ellen and I'm the program coordinator, and welcome to Vela's first event for our Sinews in the Cypress speaker series. Our Sinews in the Cypress series is part of our new Earthrising program. And through this program, we're working to educate and empower and perform our outreach with our community members on environmental and environmental justice issues. We also look to collaborate with our community and other intersectional organizations to create lasting change in New Orleans and the Gulf South. And to do all this, it's important that we highlight community members of color who do essential work in environmental preservation and sustainability that often go unnoticed. And we plan to create more language access and bring an intersectional approach to the field by putting important voices at the forefront of the conversation. And ultimately, our goal with this program is to inspire young leaders in environmental policy and advocacy for our community and our greater world community moving forward. So with that, I am very excited to introduce our Earthrising program coordinator and event moderator, Zachary Ling.
Hey, how's everyone doing? Just want to say welcome and thank you guys for showing up for our first event in our Sinews in the Cypress guest speaker series. Before we start, I just want to explain a little bit more about the name Sinews in the Cypress. We feel that the name Sinews in the Cypress speaks to the deep ties that Louisianans have to our environment, and more specifically, the wetlands. The Bald Cypress is the state tree of Louisiana. It's a staple of the most prevalent ecosystem in our state, and it's one of the most ubiquitous and broadcast species found throughout all of Louisiana. In the environmental world, often the tree is used as an ambassador for the wetlands and to help get attention to the entire ecosystem. The bald cypress is also extremely resilient, much like the population of Louisiana, and is actually resistant to decay and has been given the nickname of the wood eternal. The term sinews has two connected yet different meanings. First, it's used to describe a tough, fibrous piece of tissue that unites tissue to bone or bone to bone. The other definition is a part of a structure or system that gives it strength and binds it together. We felt that the term sinew gives a humanistic vision to the project, as well as shows the strength and resilience that the people of Louisiana and Louisiana environment displays. Lastly, when the bald cypress grows in the swamp, develops a unique texture that is often described as sinewy and resembles tendons in a person. Throughout the year, we'll be holding these guest speaker events. We'll be bringing experts from across the environmental and environmental justice field to host discussions. We plan on discussing everything from environmental racism to Black, Indigenous, and people of color's connection to the environment and water, all the way to carbon emission reduction strategies for our city and state and country on a broader scale. We plan on keeping the attendance for these events capped at around 15 to 20 people to create a more intimate atmosphere and foster an environment for open discussion. So for the speaker series, we'll be using the following format. We will initially turn it over to our guest speaker, who will give a brief presentation. Then the Vela representative, which will be me for this instance, will ask questions to the presenter. Then we'll open up the floor and take questions from the audience. In this case, what we're going to do, we're going to have you guys write your questions in the chat box, and either myself or Ellen will read them out loud to our guest speaker. And with all that said, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for today's event, Monique Harden. She is the Assistant Director of Law and Policy for the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice here in New Orleans East. She has a deep understanding of the issues of environmental justice that plague our community and city, and has worked tirelessly to alleviate these issues. Today, she'll be discussing the new executive order that the Biden administration has put out on environmental justice, and she will say what that means for us here in New Orleans, specifically in relation to the Entergy gas plant in New Orleans East. And with all that, I'm going to pass it on over to Monique.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Vela. Thank you all for being here. Again, my name is Monique Harden, and I'm an attorney here in New Orleans, and I work at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. This is an organization founded in 1992 by Dr. Beverly Wright, who is our executive director, and with the goal in mind of building the capacities of predominantly Black communities along the Mississippi River corridor to speak for themselves and have strength and power in their engagement with decision makers that were polluting their neighborhoods and communities in the area that we now call Cancer Alley, where there's some 200 petrochemical facilities that operate all day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I think in terms of looking at where we are now and some of the promise that it holds, we're really at a defining moment that I think to get a great appreciation of would help to get a little bit of historical perspective. So the environmental justice movement has its birth in Warren County, North Carolina. There was a plan to scoop up PCBs that were unlawfully spewed on a roadway to deposit that and dispose of that onto land where Black people lived. And they organized, they protested, they rallied for days, they blocked the entryway of trucks that were laden with the PCB waste. This is highly toxic, cancer-causing chemical compound. Their organizing and their days of resistance and protest garnered the attention of people from around the country. And the environmental justice movement was not only born, but also what was happening was given the name environmental racism, understanding that this is a systemic form of racism that targets Black and other people of color communities for toxic developments, hazardous land use, industrial operations, waste sites, and the like. And what we know from that beginning is not only the birth of this movement of incredible, inspiring leaders, not just here in Louisiana, but around the country and the world, in fact, but it's also heightened awareness around the ways in which environmental racism and injustice have really metastasized to climate change and the climate crisis. So that when you're looking at the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, you're also looking at the sources of nosebleed emissions, of asthma, respiratory ailment emissions, reproductive damaging emissions. They're all coming from the same sources, whether it's an industrial facility or the tailpipe of vehicles. You will see the concentration of those pollution sources in and around communities of color here in the United States and around the world. And so energy has a strong role in that, right? The ways in which fossil fuels have been burned and refined in order to provide electricity, fuel for vehicles. And that's now at a turning point as the climate crisis is, expanding and looming before us. We now have the opportunity and the ability to make energy for the first time without creating pollution. We can do that with solar panels on our rooftops. And so we have this incredible innovation. We have more technology around energy efficiency, so we can use less energy wisely and store renewable solar and wind energy, as well as focusing on health and chemical manufacturing so that we have what's called green chemistry. So the idea that you can make a product to be adhesive without bringing into it toxic chemical components. And you're starting to see that, like even products on the shelf that might have the symbols BPA free. So they're removing chemicals out of the manufacture of products. And this is all what happens when people come together, organize with a focus around health and in particular racial equity, because it's been Black and brown people largely who have been bearing the burden of the status quo of industrial operations for decades now. But we have a tremendous amount of work to be done. So we have, a new administration with President Biden, which is embracing racial equity in general, but in specifics, connecting it to the need for building environmental justice and climate justice as a priority for federal governmental actions and the ways in which dollars could be rolled out to state and local governments. And that is extremely important, but it doesn't really get us over all of the barriers, because so much of what we're dealing with environmental racism is legal. So you can have a governmental policy like an executive order, but that does not overcome or have sway over a law that says it's legal to permit pollution in African American communities or in Latino communities or in Asian communities, because those laws are not based on health. They're not based on consequences for human beings in our environment. They're really based on codifying, putting into law, the language of the law, the current existing operation of industrial facilities. So we have our whole environmental legal regime and standards really essentially is just what industrial companies do as a business practice when they're making their chemicals or refining oil or generating electricity or whatever the industrial operation may be. And I think that's extremely important to be clear-eyed about that, because we really need pollution reform standards. And people in Cancer Alley, like Rise St. James, led by Ms. Sharon Levine and so many other incredible people, and those who came before them in all of this environmental justice work, in naming Cancer Alley and fighting for health and racial equity and justice, recognize that what's needed is a permit moratorium, that this kind of permitting, it should not be legal. It should be made unlawful, and that health should come first. Racial equity should come first before we are thinking about targeting communities for toxic industrial poisoning. And so in New Orleans, beyond what's happening kind of within a national and even global framework, there's a lot of opportunities we have just being in the city of New Orleans. And that is through our city council. We're the only city in the United States that regulates an investor-owned utility company. That's Entergy. All other places in the United States that regulates utility companies regulate them at the state level through a public utility commission or a public service commission. Here in our New Orleans City Council, that's where the power rests. And that means that we as residents of New Orleans and as voters of New Orleans have really power to say what should go on our electric bills and how our energy is made and used. And the question is, how do we begin to do that? What's needed to do that? What's needed to kind of unlock those doors that have been kind of shut on residents living and participating in their government in that way, and expecting something very different from the city council that we're getting, from what we're getting now. When we're talking about the Entergy gas plant, I think it's extremely important for folks to understand that there was no justification for the gas plant. When Entergy filed the application in 2016, according to their argument, it was because they saw down the road, in the future, a growing number of customers somehow coming into the city of New Orleans and having a demand for more electricity. And that the only way they could provide it would be through the building of a new gas plant that would operate in times when normal load would be increased, like during the hottest months of the year, like in August, or maybe it'd be a week in August where they would expect to run it. When groups like Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, VELA, Alliance for Affordable Energy, 350 New Orleans, Sierra Club began to dig in and look into that, we realized that there was no data behind that. They were just saying it. They couldn't prove it. And in fact, the data was showing that the demand for electricity would be going down in future years, not up, because of energy efficiency, because more people were going with solar. In fact, New Orleans East is the largest area in the city of New Orleans with the most solar capacity. People are generating from their rooftops on solar panels. And so what Entergy did in response to our calling out the truth was to call a timeout in the process, and went back to the drawing board. And in that time, what they decided to do was come back with a second application, this time with a different justification. Their justification this time was that there would be, in the event that there was an outage, 2 outages occurring at the same time on the transmission system, that the company would need to rely on a electric generating source for the distribution system. So what do I mean when I say transmission system, distribution system? The transmission system is the high voltage power that you see on the big kind of tower transmission towers. The distribution system is basically going into the houses, into the businesses. So it's a lower voltage, and you have an electric generating or a substation, the poles, the wires, that's all part of the mix of the distribution system that connects us to the power, homes, businesses, and the like. So in this scenario, Entergy said that a situation that would cause 2 different transmission towers to fail would be cause for a new electric generating plant. And it was pretty obvious to all of us paying attention that whatever would cause the 2 transmission towers to fail would have probably also caused a generating plant to fail, because it's located in Hurricane Alley. It's right where the storm surge would come in. It's right there. Like, how could that survive, and the 2 transmission systems that are farther away not survive? But they were able to get away with it because the city council was not willing to listen to facts. They weren't willing to listen to reason, and they certainly weren't willing to listen to tremendous opposition that folks from New Orleans East and around the city expressed at numerous meetings and throughout public hearings. And so the city council actually wound up approving the gas plant. I think part of a challenge we have ahead of us is bringing a focus to the real work that our city council does that they never ever campaign on. So when people run for the city council as a candidate, you never hear them say things like, I'm going to lower your electric bill. I'm going to make decisions about energy that are going to benefit your life and improve the way you live, right? Or I'm going to do something about, that we need for this climate crisis, because here in New Orleans, we bear a lot of vulnerabilities and we can do more, right, in terms of being responsive to the climate resilience. Ways in which, having more people generating their own electricity could be a way of building resilience, because you're not waiting for one company to get more money to build one plant. It would be part of the rebuilding effort that people can get through your insurance, FEMA aid, and it would be part of the home reconstruction to rebuild back their own power systems and get back in. In fact, one of the things we experienced after Katrina was that when people were able to rebuild, they couldn't move back in because Entergy had not rebuilt the power system. And so that delayed and cut back the opportunities that people could have had in terms of getting the kind of recovery that was needed. And so what would it look like in the city of New Orleans to have a city council that was responsive to our energy needs and was thinking about very clearly what would an energy future look like, and be in conversation with residents, their constituents, and their various council districts about that? That would do a lot in terms of beating back the environmental racism that right now is legally allowed, because you would be removing those sources of industrial operations out of the mix, right? You'd be cutting out fossil fuel. You'll be instead bringing the resources and attention to residents generating their own power. I can tell you that here in the state of Louisiana, every electric generating plant owned by Entergy is in a Black community, a predominantly Black community. Wherever it is in Louisiana, it is within 1 mile to 3 miles from people who are predominantly African American in the state of Louisiana. And that is not, sadly to say, that's par for the course, where we see the bigger picture around oil, gas, and energy operations, that they're disproportionately located in African-American communities in the state of Louisiana. What does this mean now, even in terms of looking at the pandemic? Well, we know one of the emission outputs of electric generation is what's called particulate matter. This is fine airborne pollutants that are like little toxic suitcases that can be easily inhaled unnoticed. It's like finer than a strand of hair. But it can enter deep into the lungs where it can cause serious respiratory and cardiovascular problems, including heart attacks and premature deaths. With COVID, public health studies have shown that exposure to particulate matter, like the gas plant in New Orleans that it would generate when it's in operation, a tremendous amount of particulate matter as an emission in the air. It actually increases the risk of hospitalizations and deaths from COVID-19. And so when you're talking about comorbidities, the vulnerabilities of people of color to the disease, environment is a factor in that, and exposure to particulate matter of note has a tremendous role in terms of increasing the risk for folks who may be infected with the disease. So these are from the standpoint of health, standpoint of livability in our communities, and also the democracy, right? The role of democracy in our lives and having a voice in what goes on in our city council, and being very clear about the role of our city council and the responsibilities it has to all of us as residents in the city, can really go a long way in terms of bringing us closer to environmental justice and breaking down the barriers that keep environmental racism, intact in our state. So I'm going to close there and open it up for some conversation. Sure, y'all, and just what do y'all think about opportunities and ways in which, what do you see in terms of the horizon for environmental justice? What do you think is holding us back? What do you think can move us forward?
All right. Thank you so much, Monique. I really appreciate that. You touched upon a lot of different points there. Just some questions. I know you touched upon a lot, so everything that I have, you touched upon at least a little bit, but I was wondering if maybe you could get into a little bit more detail, exactly like what differentiates an issue from being an issue of an environmental issue and an issue of environmental racism, and why the Entergy gas plant in New Orleans East would be a case of environmental racism.
Say that again?
So what exactly would differentiate an issue from being just like an environmental issue to an issue of environmental racism, and why the Entergy gas plant in New Orleans East would be an issue of environmental racism?
Okay, well, I think what makes an issue of environmental racism is when you have like racially disproportionate pollution burdens or land use decisions that target hazardous or industrial kind of non-residential uses in a neighborhood where you could say, oh, well, the people are predominantly African American or Latino, right? And so where there's a history of discrimination faced by residents. And we're seeing, we see that here in New Orleans and around the country, and in fact, globally, where the brunt of pollution occurs. With regards to the gas plant, say your question one more time about the Entergy gas plant.
Just exactly why the Entergy gas plant in New Orleans East would be an issue of environmental racism. Oh, sure.
So the Entergy gas plant would be an issue of environmental racism because of its siting in a predominantly African American, Vietnamese American community. And I can also tell you that in the course of the application process, Entergy never justified the siting decision. Typically with industrial development projects, companies have to go through a siting criteria where they want to, determine whether or not the land is conducive to what they want to do, and if there's local buy-in, and for themselves analyze or make some determination regarding the impacts on surrounding communities. In this case, Entergy didn't do any of that. They just completely disregarded the fact that people live, there were churches, there's Einstein School, there's all of this happening in the midst of where they wanted to put this gas plant. They also disregarded and they also tried to use as justification that, well, this was a site that was always a gas plant. Well, that was the case in 1950s when people did not have the right to say much with regards to racial discrimination in Louisiana. It was under the Jim Crow era of racial apartheid. But even so, you can't justify what we can do better now with what we've done in the past, right? And so that's what they were trying to use as justification, was that this made sense without considering the fact that now you have to consider the impact on people, the impact on neighborhoods, and how people live. And they would refuse to do that, and our city council allowed them to get away with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. I see that there is a question in the chat
Okay.
from Cynthia. If you'd like, you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask it as well.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Cindy. I think you kind of answered it. I was just curious if they did some type of alternative location analysis or proposal, but it sounds like they didn't.
No, they
That would be
didn't.
part of an environmental assessment. Right?
Yes. So, and what you're describing is something that should be expected, and industrial companies are ready to do because they want to make sure that it's a right fit for them. They're not looking for trouble, right? With protest or opposition. In this case, Entergy didn't do it. And it was something that we had pointed out as a problem with the application. It's also something that made us research, well, where are the other Entergy gas plants and electric generating facilities? And we found that, oh, wow, they're all located very close to where African Americans live throughout the state of Louisiana. That's a problem. We even brought it up in the evidentiary hearing where I got to ask the CEO at the time, Charles Rice, if he had a problem as an African American man with Entergy owning and operating gas plants in close proximity to predominantly Black, people of color communities. And it took him a long time to try to find an answer to that. But his ultimate answer, it kind of went up the hill, down the hill, and around the woods a couple of times, but he finally came down to that he was not uncomfortable with it, but you could tell from the winding answer that he really didn't quite know what to say, that it wasn't something that was really defensible, but they were able to get away with it.
Thanks, Monique. I have another question. So what exactly, I know you touched upon the Biden administration's executive order on environmental justice. What influence can that executive order have on the New Orleans East, the Entergy gas plant in New Orleans East? And how can we use that to create change and to stop it from happening, or
Sure,
have something else happen?
Well, it's now I'm wishing I did do at least one slide on the PowerPoint, but I'm going to send it to you, Zach, and ask if you could share it with folks who registered and signed up. What it is a map of New Orleans East that we created at Deep South Center for Environmental Justice that showed the locations of what was then the proposed Entergy gas plant, which is where they wound up building it. But also other plans for industrial developments in New Orleans East. One was by the Port of New Orleans, where they're looking to lease land to industrial facilities. And then the others are areas that are right now vacant, and some of them are wetlands that were proposed for rezoning so that it would allow light industrial development. We were able to beat back the last one. We were able to beat back a proposal by, it was the city council, James Gray, who was District D representative at that time, that was looking to take all of these undeveloped, mostly wetland areas and zone them for light industrial use. So we were successful with East New Orleans Neighborhood Advisory Commission, residents, Vela, other residents, and beating back that proposal. But know that it's out there, that industrial companies especially those that are outside of the levee wall, are really looking at New Orleans East as a place to go, where they, that would satisfy some of their insurance needs and liabilities they would face without levee protection. And I think COVID and the pandemic has certainly put a damper on that. But the issue in terms of the executive order is that with the gas plant and some of the other industrial operations taking place, like rock crushing and in and around the New Orleans East area, you're an impacted community. So, you're first in line in terms of getting attention from federal agencies and departments, Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, Health and Human Services, around what should be protocols that could benefit the area of New Orleans East. So the benefit of the executive order is that it would apply to New Orleans East because of the existing industrialization, and it could apply in a way that could prevent what we know are some plans for further industrial development. That's one thing. The second thing is I think there's lots of room and potential for lowering emissions from existing industrial facilities in the community.
And it sort of just gets the federal attention onto our community and neighborhoods.
That's right. So one, it could be used as a defensive thing against further industrial development. It could also be used to really go in and look at current emissions and look at ways in which that could be lowered, or there could be some other community benefits that could be brought to bear. Then the other thing is that this becomes the executive order calls for investing in communities that are burdened with pollution. So that would mean New Orleans East would be able to benefit from that level of investment. They're calling it the EJ40. And so that's an important program to be looking out for.
Awesome. Thanks for answering that so in depth. So another question that I've been thinking about, especially when we're talking about our community in New Orleans East, what exactly can our community in New Orleans East, composing of African Americans, Vietnamese Americans, do to push back on the construction and completion of the gas plant, and maybe even other issues of environmental racism in New Orleans East?
I think it would be, step one would be getting taking a look at the permit that was issued for the gas plant and looking at those emissions and connecting that with the vulnerabilities that are here before us, COVID-19 and other health vulnerabilities from just being in the vicinity of not just one but several industrial facilities that release pollution. I think getting that picture, getting that data to present that picture is an important step one, so that everyone can see, like, okay, this is what's been allowed, this is what's happening in our community, and this is what the impacts are. And then the next step would be like organizing around what kind of changes people would want to see based on that information. But you now have a very receptive administration that where conversations can begin around engaging them on those benefits that folks have identified for themselves.
All right, thank you for that. I see that we have another question in the chat from Twee. Would you like to answer, or would you like to ask it?
Sure. Hi, Monique. Thank you
Hi,
for the
Twee.
presentation. Hi, nice to meet you. It was great hearing from you. I have some questions. I know that you were talking about emissions. So I work with the Tulane Institute for Water, Law, and Resources, and we generally work a great deal with water. So one of our concerns mainly is when there are facilities like the one proposed by Entergy, especially in Cancer Alley, like the Exxon facility, there tends to be a lot of discharge from the water that they use either to wash their plants, to cool down their plants, or to, in general, just the waste that they discharge from their chemical byproducts. What are the concerns that you have, and has anyone addressed them regarding the Entergy proposal of how they will be disposing of their waste within the community?
Yes. And I can send you, here's my email address, and I don't know if you want to put this in the chat. It's Monique H at DSCEJ. And Twee, what we, Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, Healthy Gulf, and I know Tulane Environmental Law Clinic assisted, but I don't think they actually filed comments. But I do know Healthy Gulf filed comments as we did as also with the Department of Environmental Quality, opposing the draft of the water permit for the energy gas plant. One of the issues and concerns were around failures that we saw and how the permit was drafted that did not address the full pollution loading from the that would go out into the waterway was one thing. Another one that I recall was the way the pollution and the discharge points could undermine or impair efforts that were planned for marsh recreation, marsh recreation.
Gotcha.
In that area, which would prevent against storm surge.
Okay.
And that marsh recreation work was something that's planned and was part of the Coastal Master Plan for Louisiana. And so I can send you those comments. And that could be part of maybe creating that data picture. So you're looking at it from the standpoint of air pollution and water pollution, and then you can tie those things in terms of livability, health impacts, and other concerns.
That would be wonderful. Actually, we're the Clean Water Act changed recently from the Trump administration's executive order, and it changed again from Biden's. And so we have been looking at how releases like that and discharge into non-point sources are regulated via the permits by LDEQ. So yeah, if you send over those comments, I would love to talk with you about this kind of outside of the chat, because it can get a little lengthy, I'm sure.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the work you're doing.
Oh, thank you for what you're doing.
All right, thank you so much for the question, Twee. I have just a couple more questions I was thinking. So I was gonna sort of a dual-pronged one, but I was wondering, Monique, if you could answer, what actions can like I or an individual take to help alleviate environmental racism in the community? And then also, are there any resources that you personally would recommend for folks to learn more about environmental racism?
Okay, so folks can check out for resources. Folks can check out our website, Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. It's at dscej.org. There are great books written by Dr. Robert Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright on various contexts around environmental racism, including disasters, the ways in which it undermines and impairs recovery after disasters, and what that means in terms of climate vulnerable communities that will get one disaster after another. And we're now seeing that not just in terms of hurricane summertime season, but we're now seeing that with freezing winter season. It's like we don't get a break, maybe spring, autumn, if those seasons even really exist anymore. But I would suggest those. And then there's a lot of great work that's happening locally. So just check with local groups and what's going on. Groups like Rise St. James, groups like Sankofa Community Development Corporation, the Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development, the Coalition Against Death Alley, the Green Army. They're all, they all have their websites. They're all doing great work. They have, different projects and campaigns, issues that they're working on, organizing, bringing people together to build relationships around, working together for a better New Orleans, a better Louisiana. There's also some work taking place at the state level that really connects pretty interestingly with New Orleans East. And that's something that came out of a state executive order by Governor John Bell Edwards. And it was the creation of this Louisiana Climate Initiatives Task Force. And the goal of this task force is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is pretty amazing for Louisiana. And so kudos to the governor for getting something like that established. The group, the task force includes manufacturing companies, oil and gas, and energy companies, environmental organizations, public health organizations, scientists, legal experts are all in the mix in the membership. and serving on the task force as well as advisory groups to the task force. And I'm on the legal advisory group. One of the things that's really interesting about the task force is trying to figure out what are the ways in which greenhouse gases can be reduced. And there's so some of the ideas being pushed forward are, of course, moving towards energy solutions like renewables, like energy efficiency, expanding those opportunities for that, and the technology and investing in that for communities, doing just transition work for people who may be employed in oil and gas and fossil fuel fields so that they can move into and receive training and support for as those jobs fade out. Y'all probably remember not too long ago, the Shell refinery in Convent, Louisiana closed down, and the company had no plan for the workers. And so it's like, well, who's going to do that kind of work? And so this is something that members in the task force, these are not the task force decisions, but it's ideas that have come forward from members and meetings, public meetings, so members of the public as well. There are also some peculiar proposals, which is, well, let's just keep going as we've been going. And the carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas emissions that we generate, we'll just put them in a special suitcase and stick them under wetlands. And that is and I'm not describing that probably like the proponents would, but it's close enough. And that's a huge problem because it has the potential to turn wetlands into wasteland. And that's something that, and at the same time, not really move us forward with real solutions. And we know these are going to be like real tide shifting solutions that we have to do. But if we don't, we'll be left behind in terms of being saddled with an industry that is no longer viable and land and areas of our state that's no longer livable. And that's something we don't want. So it really does mean moving our state towards making tough decisions, but it's important in terms of the change that's needed, given the crisis that we have. And it has been born for decades, long before climate change, by Black communities in the state, some of which no longer exist because of industrial operations in the state.
Okay. Thank you so much for all of that. If maybe Monique, you could send us just some of the organizations that you listed, we can then send them out to everyone that's attended.
Sure.
I do want to be cognizant of time because I know that we were planning on just staying until around 5:15, 5:30 or so. I do see a couple of questions in the chat, so I'd like to get to those. But then we'll start wrapping up. So if anyone else has any more questions, if you could quickly put them into the chat, we'll try to get to as many as we can. But I see that Malcolm has a couple of questions, so I'll let Malcolm, you can unmute yourself and I'll let you ask your questions.
Cool. I have several questions, but due to time, I'm gonna try and pick I guess like my most pressing question. So I see a lot of talk around like a carbon tax, right? But it's kind of a controversial topic. My question to you is, do you think a carbon tax could work on a local level, basically to like deter the use of fossil fuels and give like a capitalistic incentive to invest into clean energy? And if so, how would we even go about trying to push local legislators to like create one?
Well, let me just say that in New Orleans, we don't really need that kind of regime around taking climate action. We have solar developers. We have a lot of ready and willing residents and business owners with rooftops just waiting for a panel to get on top of it. So there's a lot we could be doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions without trying to create this monetizing the way in which that's done by where we can just immediately move to renewables, storage, and energy efficiency. I mean, yeah.
That leads
You
me
have a
to
follow-up, Malcolm?
that leads me to another question that I had, but I
Yeah.
don't want to, if anybody else has questions, I don't want to take up all the time. It was going to be like, how practical is individual households installing their own solar panels to like decrease the demand? Because like on the one hand, I'm like, oh, well, if we can get like communities of color to be not only more like educated in like renewable energy, but or in like climate change on a global scale, but if like we can get those communities to be able to supply their own power, like it could deter the use of fossil fuels. But on the other hand, it's like, well, if you know other communities are still using that energy, would it actually help them in the long run?
So here in New Orleans, we, our city council listened to folks here in the city that was asking for a proceeding, a decision-making process to establish what's called a renewable portfolio standard. If you look around the United States and you map, if you colored in blue, states that have renewable portfolio standards, I'm going to tell you what that is in just a minute, and states that did not, what you would see is that the states that do not have renewable portfolio standards are basically all of the former Confederate states. It's really kind of amazing. And you can see like everybody else, it's like all blue, except for, you know, kind of moving from Florida to Texas. And, you know, now, and so what is renewable portfolio standard? It's a mandate on utility companies to supply electricity from renewable sources. And so what states have done going back to 1983, and many of them have updated and improved them, has been to set a mandate that by a certain year, so much of the percentage of electricity supply would come from a renewable source. And that has included, and so that's been like mandates required of the companies with accountability measures for failure to meet those target dates. That's not borne by the customers, but the executives and their shareholders. What you see in like more recent iterations of those renewable portfolio standards are programs focused on equity and benefits for low-income families and residents so that they can obtain more benefits from renewable energy standards. And so here in New Orleans, for the first time in this sea of no renewable portfolio in the region, we could potentially be that oasis in the desert with a renewable portfolio standard for Entergy to supply electricity from renewable energy sources. And so this would be the first of the first of the first of the first, but it's possible. And our city council is right now reviewing plans, one put forward by Entergy, others put forward by ourselves and advisors to the city council to make a decision. And so we're expecting some movement on that perhaps later this month, but we're not we're kind of in a wait and see mode on that. And you can find more information about that at our website for the Energy Future New Orleans Coalition that Deep South Center for Environmental Justice is a part of. And that website is efno.org. And again, it's called the Renewable Portfolio Standard. I wish it had a better name, but that's what it goes by in this area of energy work. The other piece to keep in mind is that we now have a Department of Energy that's really interested in helping communities, especially low-income people of color communities, to begin to benefit from energy decisions as opposed to being targeted with it. And so trying to, reset that measure around equitable distribution that's fair, that's renewable, that's safe, that's affordable, that's healthy, sustainable, is something that is a kind of a priority for a senior position that has just opened in the Department of Energy, where they have a Director of Energy Justice. Can you believe that? I'm sorry, I'm still like, really? That's a title? But so that's new, that's wonderful, and we're wishing her the best. And so, you know, I think there's some really wonderful things coming down the pipe around how to, everyone knows that what's happened up to date around energy has not been fair, and it's been racist, right? And we've all, one way or another, have shared in some degree of that experience. And so there are more folks now, because of just where the technology is and where the innovation is, and also that kind of, you know, the swift kicks we're getting from the climate crisis in terms of trying to move faster and quicker in that direction that's needed.
Yeah. And just to add on a little bit, I know Monique's has touched upon the Climate Initiative Task Force. I think also their main idea is coming up with a renewable portfolio standard for the entire state of Louisiana. And as she stated, we would be the first state, or even New Orleans would be the first city in the Deep South to do anything.
Right. And so just want to separate the two things. So the Louisiana Climate Initiative Task Force, a renewable portfolio standard, is in the mix of discussions. And so this is right now is like a churning process with public meetings. And so people can give input and thoughts as the various task forces and advisory groups are meeting. And then, but in New Orleans right now, we have established a renewable portfolio standard decision-making process, and where the city council is now reviewing plans to establish something like a renewable portfolio standard for the city.
Yeah, and then we've also, I put in the chat, and then Ellen also talked about it a little bit as well in the chat, but FNO is having an Energy and You town hall meeting. Would you like to touch upon that, Monique?
Yeah, so the Energy Future New Orleans Coalition on Thursday from 5:30 to 7 will be holding a virtual town hall meeting on Zoom called Energy, no T, Energy and You. And at this town hall will be an opportunity for people to speak out about their concerns and issues that they have with anything from electric bills, how the power outage situation took place in the city, what they'd like to see for their future, things that they would like to see done better, questions they may have about the city council's role in all of this. So we'll be ironing all of that out and really working towards bringing people together around seeing that the solutions that we have are really in our local power as people, right? Essentially, we all regulate energy through our city council. And so the question is this what we want it to operate like? Are there things we could be doing better? I think the answer is, you know, pretty clear and obvious. And so we'll be getting into that on Thursday evening. And what we're hoping that will lead to is more opportunities for people to really get together and think about what do sound solutions look like. Know that, you know, down the road, there'll be another round of city council elections. What should those candidates be talking about? Should they be talking about ways to reduce our bills? Should they be talking about what we could do in terms of response to the climate crisis? Ways in which we can be more resilient in the, you know, whether it's a winter freeze situation or a crazy heat wave or a hurricane or a flood disaster. How could we make energy something that's not a life and death situation as it has been?
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Definitely would recommend everyone attending if they can. I also see that Cynthia put in the chat the link to all of the recordings for the Climate Initiative Task Force. So appreciate that. And I also saw that she put in the link for the action form where you're able to put your solution and it's open to the public to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our state. I just want to thank everyone again for coming. Gone a little bit over time, but it's okay. I really appreciate Monique giving your insight. That was fantastic. We will be announcing our next event in the Sinews in the Cypress guest speaker series in the upcoming weeks. So please stay tuned and keep following us on social media and subscribing to our newsletter to be the first to find out exactly what it is. And I believe that Ellen will be dropping it in the chat. But besides that, thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciated having you here for our first event. And thank you so much again, Monique.
Thank you all. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.